we could talk about True Blood, but we could also talk about another real life vampire, which is JD Vance.
Ooh, that's quite the segue. Let's do it.
Oh, I'm a professional. So JD Vance, in a completely unexpected development, did not give Kamala Harris brownie points for her tough talk in Guatemala about the border. In fact, no one on the right wing gave Kamala Harris any brownie points, despite the fact that she spoke like a right winger. Here is JD Vance on Fox News, just doing just that.
Well, I think it's about the fact that they don't know how to solve the problems in their own cities. Yeah. So not far from where Kamala Harris lives, not far from where Joe Biden lives, of course, in the White House, you will see tent cities all over Washington, D.C. You see these things in many major American cities. And what I find so preposterous about Kamala Harris is that she's, of course, fake about almost everything, but she seems to generally get fired up when she talks about this immigration question. But she seems to have no compassion for the people who are living in those tent cities in her own country, the country that she is the #2 chief executive for. And I tend to think that when you get really angry about something, it's often because you're the most ignorant about it. I think Kamala Harris has no idea how to solve the problems for those people. She refuses to accept any blame or any failure. And so she's just deflecting and distracting from the real problem.
But Kamala Harris, who of course now is in a motorcade, but she served in the Senate, for a number of years now. And there are 99 other senators as well. And they literally walk over the bodies of drug addicts, mentally ill people, unconscious, living right outside their office, and they never say a word about it. And then they turn this kind of moral blast furnace on the rest of us about how we screwed up Central America. I mean, that is deranged.
Well, it's extremely deranged. And if you think about the entire ideology of the American ruling class for the last 5-10 years, it's that many American citizens are privileged, that they suffer from racial fragility if they even dare to complain about the conditions of their own country. And I think what this is ultimately about is an effort to silence American citizens from complaining about the real problems that exist. Let's face the basic facts. Our cities are disgustingly violent. They're increasingly dirty. And they're increasingly unsafe to raise a family. They're also, by the way, increasingly expensive. We know that many Americans can't afford single-family homes in some of our biggest cities. I would love it if the American vice president showed even a little compassion for the people who are living in these terrible conditions in her own country. She was elected, or whatever, to govern this country. She's not doing
Oh!
Or whatever.
So
it's really rich that, I mean, this is not obviously the main point, but it's rich that he brought up how, it's seen as privileged when an American complains about their country. I mean, you're coming from the party that does that. Like, that's literally your whole shtick. Like, anytime anyone on the left or otherwise dares to criticize a simple critique of the United States of America, the right is the first to say, if you don't like it, then leave it. I mean, are you kidding me?
I will say I kind of phased out in the middle there, because Tucker Carlson's face, when it gets real still like that, like real still in the camera, kind of like ensorcels me, and I get distracted by it. But generally speaking, I just find it rich when Fox News kind of pivots back and forth between like having meltdowns about literally the most minor changes in society being the end of the world, to like this sort of position of like, well, the left is so emotionally unstable, always like crying about things like racism. It's just that's all your channel is. It's crying about, minor perceived injustices, and then like getting this haughty, like actually everyone else is the one who's emotional, while tears are usually still streaming in their eyes from like their last, breakdown about something. I don't know, a free parking sign or whatever, being a little bit too resembling of like, rainbow LGBTQ flag or whatever. It's, that's one part of it. At the same time, like, do they care about the people in America either? Is that their new pivot this week? Is like Fox News?
Point, right, Brandon? Like, oh, Tucker, you're so concerned about homeless people. Have you ever spoken to her? Like, he's accusing Kamala Harris and the Democrats of not, understanding or caring about homeless people that live outside of their offices or whatever the case may be. But it's all a dog whistle. See, the cities are so dirty, right? They're so dirty and they're so infected. But like, So she goes down to the border. They said, oh, they don't care about border security. She goes, she talks tough at the border. And then they pivot to saying, well, she's in Guatemala, essentially. That's like the implicit thing that they're saying.
A country we destabilized quite recently.
Right, but apparently she doesn't have the standing to talk about that because, you know, she doesn't speak to homeless people or care about them in you know, her own city, because she's going to California, San Francisco, liberal, dirty. I mean, that's the underlying concept here. Not that I'm defending Kamala Harris. I mean, what she said, she acted like a winner down at the border, and that's not enough. So that's why, just really quickly, Brandon, that was just why, you know, it was such a fruitless exercise and so idiotic for them to continue to capitulate and cave to the right-wing framing. They're going to do this anyway and criticize you anyway, no matter how much you sound like Jeff Sessions.
No, I actually 100% agree, Emma. And I think, you know, what's weird about that, obviously Democrats are hypocrites because, you know, they are just as responsible for destabilizing, you know, parts of South America, parts of the Middle East, parts of, you know, Africa, and causing like immigration and various other crises in, you know, at home and abroad. But the idea that they even allow people who don't even maintain the veneer of caring about like the same populations that they at least pretend to care about to set these standards for them in any real way. Like they jump through hoops for people who don't even pretend to care about the populations that they are pretending to care about. And that to me is very indicative of how like flawed our system is, because the people who are setting the standards are, one, by their own admission, don't believe that racism is real, don't believe that we should care about the homeless population. But the party who has convinced us that they are on the center left is the one who, you know, is constantly finding the need to meet them halfway and adhere to their specific standards for how to prove that they actually care, as opposed to those populations themselves who they're, you know, professing to care about, or anybody with any real expertise into how we might actually extricate ourselves from, let's say, any of our millions of endless wars. So instead of turning towards, I think, experts in the things that they claim to care about, they turn to their foils who, you know, get to set the standard for what it means to care about those things, which is just very, you know, facile.
Right. I mean, also, I highly doubt that she is literally, like Tucker Carlson said, literally stepping over homeless people to get to her office. I mean, we got to use that word correctly, right?
I mean, he is right in that the Democrats are hypocrites about stuff like that. And that's what makes, you know, it dangerous for them to not actually show any real movement on this stuff, because a lot of people will only hear like, well, you know, he's right. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden aren't doing enough at home. But this continued, like that always seems to go to the next step of like, well, here's how they would really do it. If, you know, if they were really compassionate, here's how they would show it. And, you know, unfortunately, the Democratic Party sort of bypasses any other sort of source of information about what it means to be helping communities, and, you know, oftentimes choose to jump to Republicans' hoops. And that's like such a, you know, that just speaks to our dynamic very, I think, rather not dynamic, that speaks to how we find ourselves trapped in these situations very, unfortunately.
Yes.
I mean, the Republicans were never going to give her, you know, props for saying exactly what they would have wanted her to say over there. So obviously they take it and turn it into something else to attack the Democrats for.
That's illustrative of the point that we were making earlier this week, is like, there is no appeasing them in this process. So like, you know, I mean, where does the political calculation of even doing this in the first place?
And Tucker, speaking of homeless people, was just mocking the idea of giving them housing. So, like, let's please. I mean, we're talking about compassion for homeless people. Give me a break. Glamored by Tucker says JD Vance implied VP Harris wasn't legitimately elected, saying she was elected or whatever. So even this clown pretending to be the moderate guy to help rural people is promoting the Trump election conspiracy. Exactly. Illuminati kids.
Just on that note, like pretend to be a moderate, like Vance is a Peter Thiel plant. Like this guy's part of a fascist project, I would say. And that's just my allegation, but that's something I suspect very, very strongly.
Well, I mean, he's clearly bankrolled in part and by Thiel, and also, I mean, he presents himself as a moderate because gullible liberals in cities saw his book as some sort of window into the Trump voter and held it up like that meme of the Pope holding up the CD, right? Held it up like gospel and said, "This is how we can understand how Trump won." And of course,
But is that hasn't that like facade gone away? Like, hasn't that dissipated though? Like, I don't think anyone still looks at JD Vance as some sort of, moderate.
What does he do when he gets crushed in this primary too?
Right. Yeah. You guys saw those polls. He's not even like in second or third. He's doing terrible.
I think the problem is people haven't put together JD this political freak with the guy who wrote that book that is on the shelves. Right? Like people don't know him that much.
Yeah, I don't think, for example, my dad, who loved that book, has made that connection yet. So
how'd your dad discover that book?
He's like, I
don't know. Like 20 New York Times op-eds about that.
Yeah, that's what
I was going to say NPR.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah. Because these institutions love to prop these people up and then wonder, like a couple of years down the road, where did this come from? Yeah, you propped them up when he was selling you a bunch of bullshit and you ate it up.
I mean, I think there is. Go ahead.
About that book. Let's go on, Brandon.
I think that book specifically, speaks to a kind of voyeurism that the liberal Democrat, or even just like the liberal centrist, maybe not specifically aligned to Democrat, finds themselves interested in. And like it also fits into that kind of like working class success story that we see in the the newspapers and in the TVs and in the movies, right? So this idea of like a guy growing up in West Virginia or Appalachia and then like going to Harvard or Yale and like making something out of himself is just, it fits so well into our story about picking yourself up by your bootstraps that it doesn't really speak to the fact that if it weren't so anomalous, this book wouldn't be important at all. Right? If people were if that was happening all the time, it wouldn't be such a, uplifting story, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to read some more IMs. Stop the Meal says, a huge portion of the conservative vote think Dems are satanic baby killers. Do Dems really think if they go tough in Guatemala, that's going to change any minds? Well, yeah. I mean, honestly, as I said in our segment on this, they think it's going to... They're looking towards the Beltway media, which like gives a lot of credence to right-wing critiques on border security, and so they just like filter Fox News talking points and make it more palatable downstream. That's who they're appealing to. But because they're taking it from the right wing, there's never going to be any like reality in which they're presented by the media as not soft on the border.
I think there's a degree to which they just buy the I guess ice wisdom that you need to deter this stuff with rhetoric. You need to and I think they just believe it.
Yeah. Trans Sistero Dio says lunch corruption. Emma has been bought off by Big Cashew. Certainly, yes. I mean, there we go. Maybe I'm bought off by Jeff Bezos because this is a Whole Foods cashew. Sorry, guys.